Denver International Airport was bustling with activity that cold November morning. Travelers hurried through the terminal, pulling suitcases behind them, while announcements echoed across the vast space. Amid the controlled chaos, TSA agent Scott Harrison moved through the crowd with practiced focus. At his side was Norman, a sharp-eyed German shepherd with an impeccable track record for detecting the undetectable. But today, Norman was acting differently. His ears twitched, and he sniffed the air with an urgency Scott hadn't seen before. "What's up, buddy? Smell something?" Scott murmured, tightening his grip on the leash as Norman tugged him toward the crowded seating area. At 10:14 a.m., as they patrolled the International Departure Terminal, Norman came to an abrupt halt. His body stiffened, his ears shot forward, and he let out a sharp, deliberate bark. Scott followed Norman's gaze to a lone blue suitcase sitting by a bench. His pulse quickened. Norman didn't make mistakes. Ever. Possible suspicious item near gate C12, Scott reported into his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Requesting immediate area lockdown, passengers were swiftly cleared from the area as security agents formed a perimeter around the suitcase. A bomb squad technician arrived, suited up, and began carefully inspecting the bag. Through it all, Norman stood motionless, his nose pointed directly at the suitcase, his gaze unwavering. Scott crouched beside him, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "You're doing great, boy. Let's see what's inside." Yet, deep down, even Scott felt a flicker of unease. He'd seen Norman alert like this before, and the outcomes were rarely ordinary. When the suitcase was finally opened, the tension in the air was palpable. But instead of explosives or contraband, its contents left everyone stunned. Inside was a weathered wooden box, its surface etched with delicate, hand-carved lettering. The technician carefully opened it to reveal a stack of aged letters, tied neatly with a faded red ribbon. Next to the letters was a small, well-loved teddy bear. Its fur was worn, and attached to it was a tag that read, "For Emily, with eternal love, Dad." The room fell silent. Scott felt a lump form in his throat as he stared at the items, now sitting harmlessly in the open suitcase. Norman, sensing the shift in emotion, sat beside Scott, his alert stance softening into something calmer, almost knowing. "Good boy," Scott whispered, running a hand over Norman's head. The discovery wasn't what anyone expected, but it was clear there was more to the suitcase than met the eye. Scott's mind raced with questions. Who was Emily? Why were these items left behind? And what kind of story could they tell? As passengers were slowly allowed back into the terminal, Scott knew he couldn't just walk away from this. Holding Norman's leash tightly, he glanced at the pile of letters again. This wasn't just a forgotten suitcase. It was the beginning of a mystery, and Norman had just uncovered it. The small conference room at the airport's TSA office was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Scott sat at the table, the suitcase and its contents carefully laid out before him. Norman lay by his feet, his tail occasionally wagging against the floor as if sensing his partner's growing curiosity. The stack of letters rested in the center of the table, bound by the worn red ribbon. Scott hesitated before untying it. His hands lingered over the fragile paper, the kind that threatened to crumble if handled too roughly. He carefully unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, and clearly written with care. The words began with an aching familiarity. "Dear Emily, I hope you know how much you are loved, no matter where life takes you." Scott's heart tightened as he read further. The letter spoke of apologies, missed time, and promises to do better. A father's words to a daughter. But it was the name at the bottom that made Scott's breath catch. "Yours always, Richard L. Harrison." Harrison, the same last name as Scott's. He stared at the signature, the name echoing in his mind. Was it just a coincidence? He quickly rifled through the stack of letters, each addressed to Emily and signed by the same hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the tag on the teddy bear again. There it was, Emily's name, written in neat cursive, followed by the same name, Richard L. Harrison. He leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his thoughts. His father's name had been Richard, but could it be the same man? His father had died when Scott was just a teenager. At least that's what he had always believed. Norman sat up, sensing the tension. The dog's brown eyes locked on Scott's, grounding him in the moment. "What are the chances, Norman?" Scott said softly, almost as if expecting the dog to answer. He hadn't thought about his father in years, the memories mostly overshadowed by the pain of abandonment. Richard had left their family when Scott was only 8, a quiet departure with no explanation, leaving a trail of questions that had never been answered. And now, decades later, here were these letters, written by someone who could be the same man, filled with love and regret for a daughter Scott had never even heard of. Scott's mind raced with possibilities. Could these letters mean that his father had started another family after leaving? Did he have a sister out there somewhere? The suitcase was a breadcrumb, a clue in a puzzle that Scott wasn't sure he was ready to solve. He looked down at Norman, whose steady presence reminded him that he didn't have to figure it out all at once. For now, the only thing to do was to find out who had left the suitcase behind and why. Scott sat in the quiet of his car, parked just outside the airport's TSA office. The suitcase, now officially logged as unclaimed property, sat on the passenger seat beside him, along with the letters and the teddy bear. He couldn't let it go. Not yet. The name Richard L. Harrison, paired with the familiar ache of abandonment, wouldn't leave his mind. Could the man who had walked out of his life decades ago be connected to this? And if so, what did it mean for the daughter mentioned in those letters, Emily? Norman sat calmly in the back seat, his head resting on the armrest, his gaze fixed on Scott as if silently urging him forward. Scott sighed and turned on his phone. The next logical step was to check the airport's surveillance footage. The suitcase hadn't just appeared. Someone had left it there. After a few calls and some pushing for access, Scott was back in the TSA office, staring at a grainy screen as hours of video footage sped by. The footage showed a man, hunched and moving slowly, placing the suitcase near the bench where Norman had first found it. The timestamp read 9:45 a.m., less than half an hour before Scott and Norman had passed through the area. The man wore a tattered jacket, a ball cap pulled low over his face, obscuring any clear identification. Scott watched closely, trying to pick out details. A limp in the man's step, a hesitation in the way he placed the suitcase. It wasn't someone rushing to make a flight. It felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then the man disappeared into the crowd, leaving only questions behind. Scott leaned back, frustrated. The footage gave no answers, only more mysteries. Why would someone leave such personal items in a public place? Was it an accident, or did they want someone, maybe Scott himself, to find them? He couldn't shake the feeling that the suitcase had been meant for him. It was too much of a coincidence to dismiss. His father's name, the letters filled with emotion, the connection to a daughter he'd never known. Something about it felt like a door opening to a past he had buried long ago. As Scott walked out of the office with Norman at his side, he knew he couldn't let it go. The suitcase was the first clue, but it wasn't enough. He needed to know who the man in the footage was, what his connection was to Richard Harrison, and, most importantly, who Emily was. Glancing down at Norman, Scott muttered, "Guess we're going on a little trip, buddy." Norman's ears perked up, as if he understood that this was just the beginning. The suitcase sat open on Scott's kitchen table later that night, its contents carefully spread out before him. The letters, now freed from their ribbon, were stacked neatly in chronological order. Scott had spent hours reading through them, his hands shaking slightly as he uncovered pieces of a story he didn't know he was part of. Each letter was written with a deep sense of longing, addressed to Emily, apologizing for missed birthdays, for time lost, for things that couldn't be undone. Yet, no matter how much Scott read, there were no clues about where Emily might be now, or who she truly was. But then, tucked between two of the letters, Scott found something he hadn't noticed before: a folded photograph. Carefully unfolding it, he stared at the image. It was faded, the colors muted with time, but the faces were unmistakable. A young girl, no older than 5, with blonde curls and bright blue eyes, sat on the shoulders of a man Scott instantly recognized. It was Richard Harrison, his father. The man looked older than Scott remembered, with streaks of gray in his hair, but the face was unmistakable. Scott's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real. Turning the photo over, Scott found a handwritten note on the back. Emily, age 5. Glacier National Park, 2004. Scott stared at the date. His father had left their family in 1995. That meant Richard must have started this new life shortly after disappearing. Emily would be in her mid-20s now, and somewhere out there, she likely had no idea Scott existed. The realization was overwhelming. His father hadn't just left. He had chosen to start over completely, leaving Scott and his mother behind while building a new family. Norman nudged Scott's arm with his nose, pulling him back to the present. "You're right, buddy," Scott said, his voice low. "Sitting here feeling sorry for myself isn't going to get us anywhere." He took a deep breath and flipped through the letters again, searching for anything that could lead him to Emily, or the man who left the suitcase at the airport. Then he saw it, a letter mentioning a return address. It was from nearly 2 decades ago, but it was a small town in Montana, not far from Glacier National Park. Scott grabbed his phone and quickly looked up the address. He stood and grabbed his coat, glancing at Norman, whose tail wagged in anticipation. "Looks like we're heading to Montana," Scott said, determination settling in his voice. Whatever the truth was, it wouldn't stay buried for long. With the letters and photos safely packed, Scott and Norman set out on a journey that promised answers, but likely even more questions. The long stretch of highway leading to Montana was quiet, with only the hum of Scott's truck engine breaking the stillness. Norman sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked as he watched the scenery shift from flat plains to the rolling hills that hinted at the Rockies ahead. Scott tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing with a mix of anticipation and unease. The address on the old letter led to a small town called Whitefish, a place he'd never heard of before. He had no idea what he would find there, but he knew one thing. This trip wasn't just about finding Emily. It was about confronting the ghost of his father, a man who had left a trail of questions in his wake. As the miles ticked by, Scott allowed his thoughts to wander back to his childhood. He remembered the nights spent waiting for his father to come home, only to hear his mother's quiet excuses. He's working late, or he's on a business trip. The truth came later, after Richard left for good. His father had walked out without a word, leaving behind a young boy and a heartbroken wife. Scott had spent years trying to bury the hurt, but now, with every mile bringing him closer to Whitefish, the pain felt as fresh as ever. "You think we'll find her, Norman?" he asked, glancing at the dog, who responded with a soft huff. By the time Scott rolled into Whitefish, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a picturesque town, surrounded by towering pine trees and capped by the snow-covered peaks of Glacier National Park in the distance. The address from the letter led him to a small, modest house on the edge of town. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, staring at the house. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the porch peeling, a sign that whoever lived there didn't have much time or energy for upkeep. Scott climbed out of the truck, Norman at his side, and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. He hesitated, his fist hovering inches from the door, before finally knocking. The sound echoed in the stillness of the evening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. Scott cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of how to explain why he was there. "I'm looking for someone," he said, holding up the photograph of Emily and his father. "Do you know her? Or this man?" The woman's eyes widened as they landed on the photo, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're Richard's son, aren't you?" Scott froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "You knew my father?" he asked, his voice hesitant. The woman nodded, her gaze shifting between him and the photograph in his hand. She opened the door wider, gesturing for him to step inside. "Come in," she said softly. "There's a lot to explain, Scott glanced down at Norman, who gave a short, approving wag of his tail, as if signaling it was safe. Together, they entered the small, dimly lit home. The living room was cozy but cluttered, with stacks of old newspapers and faded photographs scattered across the furniture. The woman motioned for Scott to sit on the worn couch, while she settled into an armchair across from him. "I'm Margaret," she began. I knew Richard well. He stayed here for a time when he moved to Whitefish." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and Scott couldn't help but notice the sadness etched into her features. "He stayed here?" Scott repeated, his mind struggling to process her words. "I thought he left us to start a new family. Is Emily his daughter?" Margaret hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Emily? Yes, she's his daughter," she said finally. "But it's not what you think. Richard didn't just abandon you, Scott. He was running from something or someone. He never told me the full story, but I knew he was scared." Scott leaned forward, his frustration mounting. "Running from what? Or who? He left us with no explanation. And now I'm finding letters, photographs, and an entire life I never knew about. I need answers." Margaret met his gaze, her expression apologetic. "I wish I could tell you everything," she said, "but Richard kept a lot to himself. What I do know is that he loved you, Scott. He talked about you often, about how much he regretted leaving. And Emily, she doesn't even know about you. He thought it was safer that way." The weight of her words settled over Scott like a heavy blanket. His father had been running from something, but instead of protecting his family, he had created a chasm that left Scott with nothing but questions. He looked down at Norman, who rested his head on Scott's knee, offering quiet reassurance. Taking a deep breath, Scott asked the only question that mattered now. "Do you know where Emily is?" Margaret nodded slowly. "She's here in Whitefish," she said. "But if you want to find her, you need to be ready for what you might uncover. There's more to this story than you realize." The next morning, Scott stood outside a small cafe in downtown Whitefish. Margaret had given him an address where he might find Emily, a local bookstore where she worked part-time. Scott's mind churned with questions as he peered through the cafe's window, clutching a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He had spent years wondering why his father left, but now he was about to meet the person who might hold the key to everything, the sister he never knew he had. Norman sat obediently by his side, his sharp eyes scanning the street as though sensing Scott's tension. When he finally walked into the bookstore, the soft chime of a bell announced his arrival. The scent of old paper and coffee filled the air, and shelves packed with books surrounded him. A young woman stood behind the counter, her back turned as she sorted a stack of paperbacks. She had blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail and moved with an effortless grace. Scott hesitated, his breath catching. He didn't need to ask. He already knew this was Emily. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, turning toward him with a polite smile. Her blue eyes were startlingly familiar, a mirror of the ones Scott saw in his own reflection every day. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. He had rehearsed what to say, how to explain why he was there, but all of it evaporated now that he was standing in front of her. Hi, he stammered. "Are you Emily?" Her smile faltered slightly, her brows knitting in confusion. "Yes. Do I know you?" she asked cautiously. Scott took a deep breath, glancing down at Norman as if for support. "No, you don't," he said. "But I think we're family." Her confusion deepened, and she stepped back slightly, her arms crossing over her chest. "Family? What are you talking about?" Scott reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph of Emily as a little girl, perched on their father's shoulders. He placed it on the counter between them. Emily's expression shifted as she picked up the photo, her fingers trembling. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" Scott hesitated, then said softly, "My name is Scott. Richard Harrison was my father, too." Emily stared at the photograph in silence, her face pale as she processed Scott's words. Her fingers traced the edges of the picture as if trying to make sense of it. This doesn't make any sense," she said finally, her voice trembling. "My dad never mentioned having another family. Scott felt a pang of guilt as he watched her struggle to comprehend what he had just revealed. "I didn't know about you either," he admitted. "Until a few days ago when I found the suitcase at the airport. It had this photo and letters addressed to you. That's how I ended up here." Emily's eyes flicked up to meet his, a mix of skepticism and hurt shining in them. "Wait, what suitcase? Letters?" she asked sharply, her tone shifting to suspicion. Scott carefully pulled the stack of letters from his bag, along with the teddy bear. He placed them on the counter, giving her space to examine them. Emily hesitated before picking up the letters, flipping through them with trembling hands. As she read the familiar handwriting, her expression softened, tears welling in her eyes. These are his," she whispered. "I recognize his writing. But why would they end up with you?" Scott sighed, leaning against the counter. "I think whoever left that suitcase wanted me to find it," he said. "Maybe even to find you. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm starting to think my dad was running from something, and it affected both of us." Emily set the letters down and rubbed her temples, clearly overwhelmed. "You're telling me that not only do I have a brother, but everything I thought I knew about my dad might be a lie," she said bitterly. "He was my whole world, Scott. After my mom passed, it was just me and him." Hearing the pain in her voice, Scott felt a wave of empathy. "I'm not here to take that away from you," he said gently. I need to know the truth. About why he left. About why he hid you from me, and me from you." Emily's gaze softened slightly, and she nodded, though her face was still tight with emotion. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, "then there's a lot we don't know about him. But maybe we can figure it out together." Scott felt a small flicker of relief at her words. He hadn't known what to expect coming here, but now he felt a glimmer of hope. "There's one more thing," he said hesitantly. "The man who left the suitcase at the airport, I saw him on surveillance footage. He looked older, but I couldn't see his face clearly. I think it might have been him." Emily's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "You think Dad's still alive?" she whispered. Scott nodded slowly. "I think it's possible. And if he is, we need to find him." The cafe had quieted, leaving Scott and Emily sitting at a small table with the letters spread out between them. Norman rested at Scott's feet, his ears occasionally twitching, as if picking up on the tension in the air. Emily's fingers hesitated over the photograph, her expression a mix of disbelief and sadness. "Do you really think he's alive?" she asked, her voice quiet. Scott nodded. "I think it's possible," he said. "That suitcase wasn't left there by accident. Whoever left it, maybe it was him, wanted me to find it. The letters, the photo. It feels like a message." Emily studied the picture of her younger self on their father's shoulders, her voice soft as she said, "This was taken at Glacier National Park. It was his favorite place. He took me there every year. If he's trying to be found, that's where he'd go." Scott leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Then that's where we'll go," he said firmly. Emily looked at him, skepticism lingering in her eyes. "But why the secrecy?" she asked. "If he's alive, why not come to us directly? Why leave a suitcase and disappear?" Scott didn't have a clear answer. "I don't know," he admitted, "but there's only one way to find out." By the time they left the cafe, a plan had formed. They would go to Glacier National Park together and try to uncover the truth. For the first time since finding the suitcase, Scott felt a sense of direction, though the uncertainty still weighed on him. Emily, too, seemed torn between hope and doubt, clutching the letters as they walked back to the truck. As they climbed in, Norman settled into the back seat, his tail wagging slightly as Scott turned the key in the ignition. Scott glanced at Emily. "Ready?" he asked. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "Let's find him," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions underneath. Scott tightened his grip on the wheel, knowing this journey was about more than finding their father. It was about finding the pieces of themselves he'd left behind. The drive to Glacier National Park was quiet, filled only with the sound of tires humming against the pavement. Norman sat alert in the back seat, occasionally glancing out the window as the landscape shifted to rugged mountains and dense pine forests. Scott focused on the road, his thoughts swirling. Emily sat beside him, the stack of letters clutched in her lap. She hadn't said much since leaving the cafe, but her silence spoke volumes. As they approached the park's entrance, the sight of the snow-dusted peaks took Scott's breath away. Emily finally broke her silence, her voice soft. "This place always felt like home to him," she said. "No matter what was going on, he'd bring me here. He said it was where he felt most alive." Scott nodded, a pang of envy tugging at him. His memories of their father were distant and fractured. Nothing like the bond Emily seemed to share with him. They parked near a small visitor center, where Emily pulled out the photograph again. "This was taken by a lake," she said, pointing to the faint outline of water behind the figures in the picture. "There's a spot he loved, Hidden Lake. It's a bit of a hike, but it's worth it." Scott glanced at Norman, who was already standing at attention, ready for the journey. "Then that's where we'll start," Scott said. The trail was quiet, save for the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground. The air was crisp and thin, and the towering trees cast long shadows in the fading afternoon light. Emily walked ahead, leading the way with a sense of purpose, while Norman sniffed the air, occasionally darting ahead to scout. Scott trailed behind, his eyes scanning the wilderness for any sign, any clue that might lead them closer to their father. When they reached the edge of the lake, the sight was breathtaking. The water shimmered in the golden light of the setting sun, surrounded by towering cliffs and jagged peaks. Emily stood at the shoreline, her breath visible in the cold air. "He used to sit right there," she said, pointing to a flat rock near the water's edge. As they approached, Scott noticed something. A small, folded piece of paper wedged under a rock. His heart pounded as he picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Keep going. I'm waiting,"